Hello, everyone. So I know it's been a while. Been, 7 months, 8 months or so since I put out an episode. And before I continue talking about what I'm going to talk about, I'll just explain, a little bit as to why it's been a bit of a while since I've released an episode. And in large part, basically, I've just been occupied or preoccupied with a lot of personal stuff, but then personal stuff also mixed in with political stuff, because as a lot of you know, in the city in which I live, which is Hamilton, Ontario, I do a lot of political organizing. I'm a supporter of the RCP, Communist Party, Revolutionary Communist Party in Canada. So basically, I've just been busy. Not only that, but on top of that, on the personal side at least, I'm someone that, I do struggle with mental health. I do struggle with ADD. I do struggle with, I've had bouts of depression. I've had things like that in my life for various reasons. I'm not going to give you my whole life story today, but that's been the reality. So in part, even it's been, my confidence level has been very low, and to connect that to, the broader topic of this show, which is, capitalism and how to end it, I think it's important that I also discuss or relate that to my own life. Because for me, in large part, if I put out an episode or when I have put out episodes, I'm a person that always feels underqualified, or I feel like I don't know enough, or I don't know much. And because of that, sometimes it makes my confidence level low, because I don't like to make room for mistakes. And I think that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing at all, because even though being a perfectionist means, obviously you want to be careful, you want to take everything into account before you put out an episode, or before you write an essay, or before you do anything. At the same time, it could be very, very detrimental, because it can also debilitate you. And I think in part, the way that capitalism and its emphasis on productivity over everything else, the way that capitalism functions, it kind of makes it so that it makes it even more difficult to deal with feeling inadequate, or not feeling like you have support, or not feeling like you're connected to the rest of the world. And so people can get isolated, can feel debilitated, and not as active, not as effective. And that's the kind of place I was at, when I last released an episode. And on top of that, just being busy with, figuring out where I was at in terms of local organizing that I was doing at the time. And I will bring back and iterate some of these experiences for people that are organizing concretely. And I hope everybody listening to this show is organizing something concretely where they are, because at the end of the day, we're all affected by this. And if we don't actually do anything about it, and we just intellectualize, and we just, only listen to podcasts, only go on Facebook chat groups and other forums just to talk to people within a bubble, it's useless, right? Because one thing we need to know how to do is connect with people on a one-to-one level, one-to-one basis, talking to people where we work, where we live, where we go to school, where we eat, etc., etc. And that's where we should be organizing, especially, where we are at, and meeting the masses also where they're at, and figuring out the best way in which to move forward. But anyways, that's just a brief general explanation as to why, and I'll talk a little bit more in the upcoming months as to some of my organizing experiences and some lessons we've learned in trying to build a revolutionary movement here in Canada, and where we're going from here on out. But if anybody remembers, after I released the last episode, which was about China and why I think China is a capitalist power and a growing imperialist power, although still a weaker imperialist power in relation to the United States or the EU, it's certainly on the rise currently as an imperialist power. And after I released that episode, there was a lot of support, but there was also some critiques. And I think in the next few episodes, I'm going to try to analyze some of those critiques and look at what I think might be correct in some of those critiques and what might be incorrect in some of those critiques. And I'm going to just go from there. But anyways, today I wanted to talk about what's happening in the world today. You know, what are some of the themes and concrete things happening right now in terms of like global capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and all of those general contradictions that we see on a global stage or on the global stage. So one of the most recent developments is that the United States, France, Canada, Colombia, and other comprador states, but then also a lot of other imperialist powers, reactionary powers, are attempting to oust the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, or the PSUV. So that is a huge development because it is terrifying on one front, but then at the same time, it's interesting to see the internal contradictions of Venezuela, but then also how the imperialist powers are attempting to basically do what they always do and get rid of any power or any government, whether it's democratically elected or whether they have a revolutionary movement, attempting to get rid of those threats or what they deem to be threats to their quote-unquote national security. And Obama actually is the one that said Venezuela, or the Venezuelan United Socialist Party, was a threat to the United States national security, which is absurd, but this is how imperialists work. This is how racists work. This is how fascists work. This is how bigots and people that are anti-LGBTQ, this is how these people work. They play the victim. This is what they're great at. They know how to pretend like they're in danger in order to justify the continuance of their own dominance and their own oppression and their own exploitation and murder and just disgusting activity. This is how they do that. They play the victim and try to justify bombing countries and killing thousands or millions of people, exploiting the resources of the poorest countries in the world, and then pretending as if they're helping those countries by giving them quote unquote aid and all that kind of bullshit. So this is what we're dealing with right now. And so I was disgusted, frankly, to see this happening again. And I think this is what we need to understand when it comes to capitalism, imperialism, all of these manifestations of where we currently are at as humanity, is that we have to understand that this will continue to happen unless we end and destroy literally those systems that have been put in place for centuries and centuries on end. We have to end class exploitation. We have to end racism and national oppression. We have to end all forms of oppression. And this is an important aspect. And I think sometimes what we miss as communists, sometimes what we miss as Marxists and whatnot, is the kind of emotional aspect to it, right? We have to remember that there are real people that are hungry. There are real people unable to get access to healthcare, unable to get access to basic needs. There are real people being murdered for being trans, for being black, for being poor. And this is what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And the system makes it so that the most oppressed people are eating at each other. And so it makes it hard to move forward. But anyways, to go back to the question of Venezuela, basically last week, a recent development was that a politician who's the leader of the National Assembly, I believe is what it's called in Venezuela, which is basically the opposition to the United Socialist Party. The leader of it, whose name is Juan Guaido, declared himself the interim president of Venezuela, and he was overtly backed by Canada, so Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government of Canada, United States, Brazil, Colombia, France, and other countries like Colombia, Peru, I believe was another one. And basically, this is just a disgusting attempt to overthrow a leftist government that has happened time and time again in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This is nothing more than imperialist aggression, right? It's no surprise that Venezuela has one of the largest, I believe the largest amount of oil reserves in the whole entire world. So it's no surprise that America is pushing on this front, right? And it's no surprise that these contradictions are existing. And in order to understand why these contradictions are flaring up, we have to understand Venezuela's development over the past few years internally, as well as how Venezuela relates to the rest of the capitalist-imperialist world. So we have to look at things kind of dialectically, to use the big D word, and basically look at, its internal development and its internal class contradictions, but then it's also its contradictions with the rest of the world and the national contradictions, the imperialist contradictions between the US and Venezuela, and between Russia and Venezuela, or any big power in Venezuela or smaller power also, in order to understand why this is happening. I won't go into the entire history of Venezuela, but it is important to note that Hugo Chavez, who was the previous leader of the United Socialist Party, or PSUV, as it's known as, took power through the electoral system of Venezuela. And this was in 1999. And basically, there was a huge, a vibrant movement wanted to take power, and it did so through the electoral process. And this is something I think that's important to acknowledge, because it in part explains some of the internal contradictions of Venezuela and why it's been having a difficult time. And I'll go into some of these intricacies as we move forward. So after Hugo Chavez died and passed away, he was succeeded by Nicolás Maduro after his death, and Venezuela has been basically in economic crisis for some years now. And I'll go into a little bit of why some of these economic crises have been occurring, and it's nothing new. Like, all the stuff I'm going to be talking about is nothing that we have not encountered before in world history, especially in the history of progressive governments, communist governments, more revolutionary governments taking power and attempting to fundamentally alter the way in which the society functions. And so none of this is new. This is really important to remember. Being historical materialists means being able to draw from experiences, but not just copy and paste, not just say, well, this happened here, so therefore this is why this is happening here. Not just do that. You also have to look at the differences, the context in which that country is in, and the differences between this context and the context in 1918 or 1949, whatever it may be. But there are still general themes, and there are still things that kind of remain fundamentally true for the most part in most contexts. So a few other things that are important to note in conjunction with this is that Venezuela has one of the biggest oil reserves in the world and does have support of large segments of the working class in the country. And this is due to the fact that many social programs and such have been put in place to better the position of the poor working class ever since the party took power in 1999. And this includes, educational programs, access to cheap food, some strides towards indigenous rights in Venezuela, and much, much more. All things that any communist or any socialist would seek to establish after taking power. This also means that the wealthy petite bourgeoisie middle classes and the capitalist ruling class are not fond of the Socialist Party, and that's in part going to explain some of these contradictions that we're seeing. And on top of that, it means that other imperialist and capitalist nations are opposed to them. The nature of being a socialist or a communist government is that people are against you. Even social democratic. Even though I'm a Maoist and I'm completely against social democracy and all its manifestations, there are contradictions, obviously, between social democratic policies and attempts to install kind of social democratic values within capitalism, and between liberals and between reactionaries. And I think liberals are reactionaries most of the time too, in my opinion. But anyways, for the sake of discussion, But yeah, the nature of being socialist, the nature of being communist, whether you take power through the ballot box or through a large revolutionary movement that goes against and smashes the state as it stands, either way you do it, you will get backlash. You will have internal contradictions. That is the reality of building communism, the reality of building socialism and transitioning to communism. That is the reality. And it's not as if capitalism did not also have these contradictions. And that's an important, this is kind of an aside, but it's also an important point, because when arguing with people that are kind of pro-capitalist, the thing that's interesting is that they speak of capitalism as if, you know, it just sprouted up one day and took over all of a sudden. But no, there were literally periods in history where capitalism developed on a particular port or in a particular city and was utterly destroyed because of the contradictions between kind of what was considered the middle class bourgeoisie in the context of feudalism, which was the merchant class that became the capitalist class, between them and between the monarchists and the people who were kings and lords, not serfs, and lords and queens and things like that. There were contradictions between the two classes, and at times the capitalists or the bourgeoisies lost, and sometimes for centuries at a time. And I'm hoping in future episodes to kind of bring some of these examples to fore, because I think it's really important to understand the development of capitalism and of any mode of production, because it's not something that just happens overnight. It's not something that happens easily. It takes steps forward, it takes steps back, it learns things along the way in order to better function and win, basically, in the end. And that's what we want for communism. We want communism to win. And that means being critical, that means having an open eye, that means being a materialist and looking concretely at the way things develop and where they may or may not lead, and hopefully don't lead, in the case of Venezuela and the complete collapse of the United Socialist Party. That would be pretty devastating on the front of fighting imperialism. But anywho, like I said, the problem with any leftist government, whether it be revolutionary communist or social democratic, is that you still have to deal with class contradictions that arise after taking power. And this is me speaking on some of the internal contradictions now of Venezuela. In other words, if you undermine capitalism by building socialism, which is inevitable, especially for poorer nations, you have to find ways to combat the capitalist forces. In Venezuela, over the past few years, Maduro has attempted this, by doing things like fighting corruption, throwing some corrupt officials in prison and whatnot, but yet the crisis still seems to be kind of getting out of hand right now, right? And earlier I mentioned that Hugo Chavez and the Socialist Party took power through winning elections, and this is an important point. And the problem with leftists taking power through institutions that were basically created by capitalists or colonialists, imperialists, is that, if you do that in order to maintain power, you end up legitimizing the quote-unquote democratic institutions that were built before you, but not for you, right? These institutions were built in order to help capitalism function. Therefore, even if you take power, the capitalists and, store owner, middle-class capitalists, and the big capitalists, big bourgeoisie, those with capital, simply have to sabotage the economy by withholding products, marking up prices, or fleeing the country, right? So, because if you're a capitalist and there's a party in power which is doing a lot more for the working class, those who you exploit, than for you, you're not going to be very happy about that. You're not going to be able to make as much money. You're not going to be able to compete as much as you would like. You're not going to be able to do all the fun capitalist things as easily as you did beforehand. So that means that you're going to be pissed off. You're going to find ways to sabotage the system. The same way as proletarians and as workers, we find ways to destroy the system. We find ways to sabotage the capitalist system that is not in our favor. They do the same thing for socialism. It's the nature of your class composition, the nature of where you stand and how you relate to the means of production, how you relate to surplus value and things like that. So even if you take power, the capitalists, the store owners, those with capital, those who own the big companies or the CEOs of the big oil and other factories and things like that, other companies try to sabotage the economy. And to make matters worse, the Socialist Party never really dismantled the capitalist class, but merely found the means to nationalize a large amount of the private sector, especially when it comes to oil. And one of the most profitable commodities in the world is oil. We all know that, right? We all have heard these jokes and comments and statements about Iraq and why it was invaded because of oil, and why the US is even in the Middle East or in Africa or in any other countries, or why any imperialist country is in anybody else's country is because of the geopolitical benefits that it has. And those are always economic benefits most of the time. Not most of the time, usually all the time. Because even if you take over a country that is not necessarily resource rich, it can be close to one that is resource rich. Therefore, you can pivot yourself or put yourself in a good position to take over that person's resources and take over, for example, Iran's resources. Right now, Iran is a country that's kind of circled by US bases and US forces all over the Middle East, right? And my point here isn't to say that all of these contradictions manifesting in Venezuela are merely the fault of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro and the Socialist Party just because they chose to win an election. But to understand things dialectically and accurately, we have to understand the internal dynamics of the country, its internal class relations, and also how it relates to things external to it, like the rest of the capitalist world. It's not enough to merely blame the capitalists and imperialists, although that is certainly a major aspect of this, and we'll get to that. And their imperialistic aggression is completely disgusting. Venezuela should without a doubt be defended from that imperialist aggression, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an understanding of internally why we might lose, right? Why they might lose, why this is happening concretely, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, because even in the case of the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union no longer exists, and they had a revolution not through the ballot box. They had a revolution, with arms, through civil war, through that long and hard process. But at the same time, look at the difference. Even when the Soviet Union was at its best economically, let's say post World War II, the internal contradictions were, in a sense, easier to deal with, when Stalin was in power, because they actually did more, in a sense, to get rid of the capitalist class. And the same goes in China to a large extent. Although there's many differences, and we can go into all those specifics in the future, for the most part, they got rid of the capitalist class as they were functioning, or they heavily suppressed the capitalist class. And in Venezuela, that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, there's clearly pressure on the capitalist class, but the problem with just winning that election is that, you have to justify why you have to maintain power and compete with the capitalist parties every single election, right? And I don't think that's not a long-term strategy, because the second you legitimize the democracy, or the bourgeois capitalist democracy, bullshit democracy, what happens is that the second that you want to maintain your power by rightfully considering such and such capitalist or such and such reactionary to be a traitor of the people, to be a traitor of the nation, what happens is that they can say, well, this is, you won power through this institution, therefore we have the right to also win power through this institution, which is the bullshit capitalist institution. And I feel like now Venezuela is reaching this point where it is becoming inevitable that they're facing this reality, that they're just going to have to get rid of those capitalists or suppress them in the proper way, or the classic communist way, which I think is what needed to happen from day one. And I think that has to happen. And if it doesn't, it will be very bad for Venezuela. That's what I think personally. But either way, like I said, it's not a guarantee. Like I said, just Just because you didn't do it through an election, just because you didn't take power through an election, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to maintain power, right? You can still lose militarily or in other avenues. I'm not claiming that that's the sole reason why all this is happening, but it is an important thing to recognize and acknowledge. And even, for example, China, which, like I said in my previous episode, even though I consider China to be a revisionist country that is a capitalist country and more every day moving towards capitalism, it's interesting that because of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 and because of taking power through a mass revolutionary movement that goes against the institutions set up by the colonialists or by the reactionaries, because of that, what that means is that China has been able to have more control of its internal dynamics. Even after the death of Mao, with the rise of revisionism in China, or the overthrow of the more revolutionary aspects of the party, it's still the case that the party is able to have way more control over its internal dynamics, which is why the states and the rest of the other imperialist countries hate China so much, and still have to work with it, is because at the end of the day, they do have control over their economy, because they did get rid of, the more reactionary parties and the more reactionary elements and capitalistic elements when the revolution initially happened. So they set the precedent that this is a new era, this is a new system, a new situation that we're creating that is not the same as a bourgeois democratic capitalist system. And capitalists will look at that and say, oh, that's a quote unquote authoritarianism or totalitarianism, all these bullshit words that they create to ignore the reality that a capitalist democracy is not even a democracy at all. If anything, it's a plutocracy where, a small amount of very rich people actually are the ones that determine what goes on, and your vote does not mean shit at all. But it is an important point to note that even China is able to have more control of its economic situation because of having a revolution where you actually smashed the state apparatus as it previously existed and created your own institutions and your own ways of making society function. That is important to note. The Soviet Union also had an economy that grew swiftly, since it did more to suppress the capitalist class before the revisionist shift towards capitalism occurred. But overall, it's still important to note that. And I'm going to go a bit more into the actions of the capitalist imperialists in a bit, but it's a huge lesson, I think, for the working classes of the world to know that legitimizing capitalist bourgeois elections and quote-unquote democracy makes things a lot more difficult in the long run, because it makes it harder to suppress the capitalists or the movers of money when you use their own institutions created to limit what you can do to the ruling classes. A true proletarian dictatorship means absolute power for the proletarian working class and their party. And this is not without ebbs and flows and its own contradictions, but certainly in the long-term benefit of building communism for the benefit of humanity as a whole. And if you look at the history of Venezuela, it's easy to understand why the working class supported this huge wave of progressive politics that swept the country. But now the contradictions are becoming pretty clear, and we can only hope that the imperialists are defeated in this recent bout of aggression, and that the working class learns from these experiences in the long term. So to briefly go over what I just explained a little bit in terms of and this is very brief, I'm not giving super detailed analysis of Venezuela's internal dynamics since Hugo Chavez took power, because that would be a 3-hour long episode. And although this topic will certainly come back, and this will certainly come back as a topic, even if it's not Venezuela specifically, maybe I'll have a guest on to talk about it, or maybe we'll talk about another aspect of Venezuelan history to help us better understand the current situation. And we'll be able to talk specifically about who is in what position and more detail, more names, more things like that. But overall, what I just explained, to give a quick review, is that basically the Venezuelan United Socialist Party, which took power in 1999, won an election and had a huge mass movement supported by the working class in Venezuela. put together all these programs and social programs, and basically did this through like kind of subsidies and loans or grants, whatever word you want to use. And that in part explains some of these contradictions. And so on an internal level, or the level of for revolutionaries trying to understand what it means to have a revolution, I think it's important to take note that it's better to have a revolution. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, it's better to build a long-term movement, have a people's war, and take power and build your own institutions, build your own country, build your own nation that is completely, for the most part, separated from the capitalist institutions and the capitalist ways of making society function. Because if you keep the capitalists intact, or the oligarchs intact, and you don't do much to suppress their activity, they will simply react, which is why we call them reactionary. And because they have had power for much longer, and they have more support from other countries in the world that are imperialist, because we still live in a capitalist world, a world dominated by capitalists and imperialists that are capitalists, then that means they will have backing and support, and will attempt to overthrow you and destroy you based on the fact that, you know, there are still internal capitalists that they can tell to just declare presidency, and oh, this person's now the president that we recognize because we like him more than him or her. Like, that's ridiculous. It's pretty ridiculous, you know. It's pretty ridiculous. But the lesson is that, like, yeah, this is why it is really important, the concept of having a protracted people's war, or a long-term people's war, where you actually build a revolutionary movement to build your own institutions and build your own country, assuming that protracted people's war, that long-term period before the revolution, you know, to ensure that it actually is successful. Once it is successful, then you can actually get rid of the bourgeois institutions, the capitalist institutions, bullshit institutions, and build something for the working classes that will actually sustain itself, not without contradictions, not without difficulties, but it will make it easier. And I think historically that's been the case. And I feel like right now the Socialist Party, United Socialist Party, and Nicolas Maduro's government is at this standstill, where basically they have to either make that leap that I'm talking about, which is to say completely smashing those institutions, or continue to legitimize those institutions and, you know, do some minor suppression here and there, but that's not enough in the long term to actually sustain a working class revolution. So hopefully, I hope the Nicolas Maduro government makes that leap towards, you know, a more revolutionary understanding of maintaining power, and a more revolutionary understanding of sustaining and building a real dictatorship of the proletariat, instead of just winning or holding power for as long as possible until things go haywire. So that's the kind of place we're at right now. And I feel like, from my analysis, that's where Venezuela is at right now. Now, though, to touch on, you know, I talked a little bit about the internal sabotage of the internal capitalists, and how that relates to the working class movement in Venezuela, and the PSUV and the United Socialist Party, or the PSUV / United Socialist Party. But now I'm going to touch on some of the external dynamics, right? Talk a little bit about Venezuela's relationship with the rest of the world, in a sense. So to touch a bit on the disgusting attempts to reinstate a reactionary government in Venezuela, and this is nothing new. We've seen this happen time and time again, you know, where imperialists like the US, Canada, France, and their comprador goons like Colombia basically get rid of leaders and parties that are more progressive for their own benefit as imperialists. The funny thing about this is, like, look at France right now. Like, you legit have people, you know, you had the whole yellow vest movement happening in France right now, where people are literally dumping doo-doo all over like government buildings, and Macron has the gall to even stand up and talk about Venezuela's contradictions and Venezuela's problems. It's like, look at France right now. Like, gee, look at the States right now. Like, things are wild in terms of like internal contradictions, you know, with Trump and what's happening right now between the Democratic Party having, you know, a new face, a new black face to kind of dupe and fool people into voting for, oh, well, she's a black woman, therefore vote for her, even though she's just like Hillary Clinton, if not worse. But anyway, for them, it's simple. For the imperialists, it's simple. You know, the more social programs that are put in place for the poor proletarians and the poor peasants and workers of Venezuela, the less profit there is to be made for their businesses and firms overseas. So the same businesses and firms that create super profits for their imperialist countries, so let's say example from the perspective of the United States, that might have some businesses in Venezuela, things like that. It also puts a chokehold on their businesses if the poor working class is given more than they are, basically. And so imperialist countries having more control over all the resources in the world would mean that they maintain their global dominance and that the capitalist imperialist class maintains its global hegemony. What's more disgusting are the bullshit explanations that they use in order to justify why they're doing what they're doing. Like, just think of how America or Canada would react if some random politicians or a random politician that was backed by North Korea or China suddenly declared themselves to be the interim president or prime minister of Canada or president of America. They would fucking flip and definitely lock those people up, assassinate them, charge them with treason, do whatever the hell they're going to do. Oh, but yet that wouldn't be suppression, right? Like, it's just imperialist hypocrisy is the most disgusting thing ever. Like, just imagine that some other country having bases or supporters bases surrounding America or Canada, and then they want a different person aside from Justin Trudeau or Trump to be leader, and then they're just like, yeah, we recognize this person. Tell me what would happen. You tell me, please. Anyways, nobody would let that shit fly. Yet in the case of Venezuela, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, etc., we're supposed to just sit down and accept that Canada, America, and France get to recognize who the leader of Venezuela is. It's just disgusting and hypocritical. And this is the nature of imperialism and capitalism. And it's horrible. Like, the hypocrisy is just wild. On top of it all, the reasoning they use as to why Venezuela's economy is in turmoil is pretty hilarious. I mean, they basically admit that the main reason that it's happening is because the capitalists aren't happy about the amount of funding going into social programs and the like, but they just code and cover it in capitalist language and jargon that obscures the reality of what's going on. According to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and this was written in the year of 2014, so this is, I believe, right after Nicolas Maduro took power, and I'm going to be quoting here a little bit, and then I'll explain what this is saying. And this is talking about basically Venezuela's internal economic problems. And this is what they say, and I quote, "Such subsidies created positive results with respect to social projects and social inclusion, but their success came with a high cost. According to Juan Carlos Martinez Lazaro, professor of economics at the IE Business School in Madrid, Martinez Lazaro notes that during the Chavez years, the government pursued an economic policy based on subsidies in order to create a social clientelism, a system that depends on patronage relationships in which officials do special favors for their clients, which has brought the country to real ruin." Basically, the subsidies that are being mentioned here are the programs and social programs that the government funded, and the money that they use to fund these programs obviously comes from either through owning larger segments of certain industries, for example, the oil industry in Venezuela, or through other means, and or through heavy taxations on the wealthy, things like that, and then basically distributing the wealth through creating these social programs, through educational programs, so on and so forth, to raise the standard of living for the working class people of Venezuela. And this is good for the working class, but not for the capitalists. So they admit, mind you here, they admit that such subsidies created positive results with respect to social projects and social inclusion. This is their words. So it was good for society, is basically what it's saying. It was good for society, but it's bad because, yeah, anyways, we'll move on. And so I'll quote another part here. It says, and I quote, "Among the key mistakes made by the government," Sabal notes, "are a growing public debt, which is already too high, excessive public sector spending, which has been financed by the creation of a lot of currency that has also translated into the current inflation numbers, as well as the risk of extremely high inflation and the exchange controls and unreal price levels that have choked off private sector activity. Private sector companies have faced persecution by the government," Sabal says, noting that, in an attempt to control inflation, Maduro issued a decree that lowered the prices of electrical appliances because he accused firms of, in some cases, selling the products at a profit of 100%. According to Sabal, this approach has led to the gradual withdrawal from Venezuela of many companies because they have decided to close down or because they have moved to other countries. The result has been an almost total dependence on imports in order to keep the country supplied. Close quote. So, in other words, they didn't make the capitalists happy, so they chose to withdraw or take their business where they'll be able to profit according to capitalist principles. In other words, to earn profit for profit's sake. And basically, there's a contradiction between what the working class and the poor people of the country need and the capitalist class, or the people that own everything, and what they think their needs are, which is, earning profit for profit's sake, benefiting and enriching themselves for the sake of themselves as individuals over that of society as a whole. So yeah, they didn't make the capitalists happy, so they chose to withdraw or take their businesses away. So a lot of these businesses actually left, which, leaves a place, if every business in a given country leaves, or if a majority or half or even 25% just leaves, that causes a lot of turmoil because you have to build new connections to get new products and new commodities into your country. And that's not a good thing. It causes economic turmoil. But this is what the capitalists do, right? When they're not happy, they whine like little babies and they run away, or they withhold products, or they mark up prices. They do whatever they have to do because they're just thinking about profit as capitalists, as a land owning, factory owning, just owning ruling class. That's what they do. That's how they have to function. And it's disgusting, but that's how they function. And this is why we have to get rid of them. So basically here they argue that the government is taking an overly politicized approach towards developing the country. But they'll never understand that these contradictions, where the working class seeks power in some way to benefit itself, is fundamental to capitalism and imperialism. It's an inevitability due to the nature of capitalism, right? Capitalism is exploitative. It steps on the proletarian class, it steps on the working class, and therefore that working class will rise up, will organize unions, will do whatever it has to do to get as much as it can. And that's what happens when you oppress people. That's the nature of oppression. Capitalism is horrible, ruthless, it's exploitative, and the hard work done by workers and the way it treats people as disposable items is what forces the proletariat to take power to determine its own existence. And another aspect of this that I'll quickly mention is basically the reality of sanctions, right? We all know that when a given country goes against the wishes of the imperialist powers in the world, there are external sanctions put onto this country. So aside from the businesses of the imperialist countries leaving, or aside from the homegrown capitalists leaving, on top of that, you have the dynamic of sanctions being put upon a given country in order to basically force or bully that country into doing what the rest of the imperialist world wants them to do, which in this case would be to not help your own working class because it doesn't make the homegrown capitalists or the foreign capitalists happy. And happy means not taxing them as much. Happy means not allowing the state to own as much or to manage as much of the profits and surplus value as they currently do, in order for them to be bigger, better capitalists in relation to other capitalists, to compete and pat themselves on the back for being gods on earth. What's funnier is that the professor Felipe Monteiro uses what he considers to be two good examples of oil-rich countries using their wealth wisely. And so, like I explained a little bit before, Venezuela is an oil-rich country, so it has a really, really big resource that is crucial for world development and has been crucial in the past century or so or more. And so this is important because this also explains why the US is so fixated and why Canada and all these other imperialist countries are so fixated on Venezuela, because they want that oil to be used for the benefit of themselves instead of for the benefit of the people of Venezuela. And at first, when I read this, I was like, you know what? Let me give these capitalist economists the benefit of the doubt. I was like, let me see what they have to say about Norway or about any other oil-rich country that is somehow better, or what makes them so much better and the way they function so much better than Venezuela. So I decided to do a bit of research, right? I was like, I'm not just gonna look at the surface stuff and say, well, yeah, Norway is European imperialist, therefore, how can you compare it to Venezuela? I was like, no, let me look at the details. Look at the details. I'm not gonna just say it's imperialist. I'm gonna explain to you how it's imperialist with some details. So anyways, the first example that Mr. Monteiro uses as a good example of an oil-rich country using its wealth wisely is Norway. That's the first example. And the other is the Emirates of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. That's the other example. And I'll briefly talk about the latter, but I'll talk about the former, which is Norway first. And for Norway, they suggest that what makes it so good is that, and I quote, Norway funneled much of its oil sector surplus into a sovereign wealth fund worth more than 800 billion at the end of 2013. Close quote. Which basically means that Norway takes some of its surplus that it earns from its oil, selling its oil through, or through whatever means, and whether it's for selling it to this company or that company, doing whatever it has to do. It takes that surplus, it allots a certain amount of profit and invests it into particular things to make more capital and money for the long term, right? So if let's say I produce, apples in my backyard, and, I grow a bunch of apples, put the seeds in, blah, 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 do whatever. And then I sell those apples when I go to the market. And then once I sell those apples, I allot a certain amount of money that I make from those apples to invest in other projects that other people are doing to make more profit down the line. So that means buying shares in a company and investing in certain projects and other capitalist enterprises in order to make more money down the line. So this is what the Norwegian government does to make more money for itself. And this is what this economist is saying is a good thing. And I'll go into the details now. So this sounds all well and good from a kind of, capitalistic perspective on the surface, but I decided to look into this so-called fund and where it actually invests its capital. And what I found was pretty eye-opening, and it should be for you too. So I looked at this government pension fund of Norway. So that's what that fund that I mentioned in that quote that I kind of briefly explained, that's what it's called, the government pension fund of Norway, where they allot a certain amount of profits to invest in other projects to make more capital and more money down the line. And, I looked at where some of its earnings actually come from. And at first glance, some of them included companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Tencent. So these are all, companies that we know to be, they manufacture iPhones and smartphones and things like that. and other technologies. And keep in mind, we already know that these companies are some of the most exploitative companies in the world. Apple, for example, we know, some of their factories in Asia and in other places where they're exploiting the hell out of people. People are being paid dirt poor wages to manufacture and make these iPhones for, the first world, and for those with a little bit more money, and they're paid next to nothing. We already know that. We already know the long hours they work. We already know about the suicides that some workers are forced to have to do because their lives are so miserable. We know about all these things. And these are the companies that this government pension fund of Norway funds. Like, this is what they invest in. This is what they're investing in. This is where their money is coming from. And they're suggesting that Venezuela should do the same thing. A government that has morals and is trying to help build a working class movement. Even if I disagree with the way and certain ways in which it does that, it does want to build socialism or something like socialism at the end of the day. So to suggest that it should also invest in some of the most exploitative companies in the world, I find to be pretty revolting. But this is what these bourgeois economists, capitalist economists, are suggesting. But anyways, I'll continue. So we already know how these companies exploit the living hell out of workers globally, giving them dirt poor wages, extracting billions from their labor. But that isn't all there is to this fund. They also invest in many companies, mostly American, but some being Canadian, British, and others that produce various different technologies, we'll say for now. And when I looked at some of these technology firms, it was noted that many of them are involved in producing military technology or technologies that benefit imperialism directly and militaristically. So they're actually helping. This fund is investing in military projects. It's helping build weapons and tanks and things like that. Like, that's disgusting. This government pension fund, it pretends to have morals. This is the crucial point, because people sometimes will be like, oh, the Scandinavian countries are so awesome. Yeah, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, whatever. They use these countries as an example, as like some dope ass shit every day. And this is the kind of shit they fund. So anyways, it pretends to have morals, and it claims to have only reinvested in those companies, that they divest or take their money out of. So for example, some of the companies, maybe in Norwegian law or whatever, it's written that, this government pension fund cannot help any company that makes nuclear weapons, for example, right? So a lot of the companies that they've actually divested from or taken their money out of and stopped investing in, they stopped investing in those companies when they began to help build nuclear weapons or began to do nuclear things, which, sounds good on the surface, but the thing is this, like, they have claimed to stop investing in some of these companies, especially when said companies began to be involved in manufacturing nuclear weapons, and claim to have only reinvested in those companies when the nuclear activity stopped. But this is nothing but sheer bullshit and hypocrisy. Even if said company, that the Norwegian government pension fund chose to fund, stopped being involved in making nuclear weaponry or technologies, they still help in the production of fighter jets and other security equipment that directly assists militaries in policing the world. For example, the British firm BAE Systems, which the government pension fund of Norway stopped investing in when it was the year of 2005 because they helped in the production of nuclear missiles for France, was reinvested in when it was 2013. So let me say that again. The government pension fund of Norway stopped investing in BAE Systems, a British firm, in 2005, but invested in it again in 2013, supposedly because it stopped being involved in nuclear weapons. This is hypocritical because the company clearly made a shit ton of money by making nuclear weapons for France, and that's why it even still exists as a firm today. So you can't claim to have only invested in it when it was being good and not making nuclear weapons. Not only that, but the company literally, according to itself, and I quote, "We design, manufacture, upgrade, and support combat vehicles and provide ammunition, precision munitions, artillery systems, and missile launchers to a global customer base. Therefore, this literally means that the so-called Government Pension Fund of Norway invests in the production of violent weapons that help imperialists maintain their power over weaker nations. It pretends to care about the world by not investing in nukes arbitrarily, but yet it's okay with fighter jets, tanks, missiles, and more. Like, that's pretty ridiculous. It's pretty ridiculous. Like like let's be real. Like, you know, like, you can blow me up with a nuke or shoot me in the head. Either way, fuck you. So this is not a good thing whatsoever. But this is the hypocrisy of imperialism, especially the more social democratic imperialism of Norway and stuff too, right? So it's like you have these economists saying, well, if only Venezuela did something similar to what Norway did and funded some of the most violent and horrible companies in the world, then maybe it would have a better off economy. But that's absurd, right? That's absurd. So it pretends to care about the world, but it's BS. And mind you, this is only the tip of the iceberg. You know, there are far more companies they invest in that are engaged in the most disgusting forms of capitalist exploitation. Yet here we are with the capitalist bourgeois economists and specialists suggesting that Venezuela follow suit and invest in these kind of horrible companies instead of helping its poor working class population with what it makes from oil. It's pretty horrible. The other example it uses is Dubai, which I don't have to say much about because it's pretty. Yeah. Anyways, the other example is Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, but those nations are also known tax havens that basically have slave economies where migrant workers do all the work while the ruling class benefits from capital investments that come from abroad. So they use that oil to benefit some of their local population, which are a lot of rich people, right? Like, people, mind you, there are poor people too, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of rich people in a place like Dubai. Dubai is an extremely developed place, in part because it's a tax haven. So if you want to send your money there, it's really cheap for you to do so because they have next to no taxes that you have to pay. But that also means that those profits being sent to them is literally the blood, sweat, and tears of people that they've exploited in many places in the world, whether in their home countries or in other countries. And you know, and this is the reality, right? And this is what these bourgeois capitalist economists are saying that Venezuela should do, right? So Venezuela should become a tax haven? Or it should fund literally the most horrific forms of weaponry and weapons that benefit imperialists. That's horrible. But anyways, yeah. And another thing about Dubai and the United Arab Emirates is, like, I even have a cousin who lives in Ghana, who a lot of young girls are actually hired from Ghana and from other African countries to work in places like Dubai, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. And basically what happens is that they hire these women as migrant workers and as maids. So they basically will be hired and they work like 24/7 in these rich ass people's houses. They're paid nothing. They're not allowed to leave the house. They're not allowed to leave the city, the neighborhood. A lot of the times they take their passports from them. So this is the reality of Dubai. This is the reality of these places where, and anytime there's laborers, they're literally brought in from other countries, and they're like the most desperate poor people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, other places. This is where they're taking laborers from, and literally, like, workers die making buildings and stadiums and things like that in the UAE and in Dubai and all these oil-rich countries. And this is seen as some sort of bastion of, like, good commerce. Like, this is the reality of capitalism. This is how disgusting it is, you know. Like, this is what it is. So anyways, those are horrible examples. But leave it to people sympathetic to capitalism to think that those countries are successes. Countries that live off of the blood and sweat of the most oppressed nations in the world. Countries like Norway, which uses its surplus to fund the manufacturing of imperialist weaponry and to coax its working class at home. Disgusting and horrible. And so, to sum things up, and this is by no means a complete and comprehensive episode, the reality is this: any socialist revolution should ensure as to not legitimize the bourgeois electoral system, and also to make sure to establish a complete, as much as possible, complete dictatorship of the proletariat by smashing the capitalist or bourgeois institutions and creating its own. So we shouldn't give the masses any illusions. We should explain to them that the bourgeois electoral process is bullshit, and that way we can build a long-standing revolution that crushes the capitalist class in the long term. And we do that by smashing their systems and modes of organizing society that suit capital and not the people at large. And that's like the one little critique, or it's not really little, but that's the one critique I would have for the PSUV, or the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. I'm completely in defense of Venezuela. I'm completely in defense of the government in relation to it, to imperialist aggression. America needs to stop. France, Canada, all these bullshit imperialist countries need to stop, because this could literally explode into a World War III type situation, which might be inevitable, but is not a good thing, right? Nobody wants that. We don't want that to happen, but we still want to build a revolution. We still want to determine our existence as proletarians, as oppressed peoples of any nation. We want to be able to do that on our own terms, and we can't do that with imperialist aggression, right? Can't do that if someone else completely destroys your country. I mean, look at Iraq and Afghanistan today. It's horrific, right? We don't want that. With that said, any true communist should defend Venezuela wholeheartedly, regardless of the criticisms we might have of the leadership there. And I'm saying this as a Maoist, right? People have this conception of Maoists as like ruthless, critical people. But yes, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't have concrete stances on imperialism and things like that. I mean, sometimes, yeah, sometimes people make ultra left errors, or like or other forms of errors. That happens, but that is not every single Maoist ever, right? Like, this is complicated. Anyways, so yeah, solidarity with the Venezuelan proletariat and those that understand that a proletarian dictatorship is the only way to go about revolution. And I hope the imperialist pigs and social chauvinists burn in hell for endorsing any sort of coup in Venezuela. And even though, scumbag opportunists like Bernie Sanders are claiming to be against a coup, he still lays the ground for a coup in claiming that Maduro's government is violating the Constitution, or that dissolving the National Assembly was a bad thing. His liberalism is so strong that he can't see these contradictions in any concrete way, which is why his old ass is also running as an opportunist Democrat. If he ever took power in the States, expect that US imperialism and aggression would continue. Also expect that we'd see the same kind of hypocrisy as we've seen with the Norwegian state that pretends to be progressive by not funding nukes, yet it still benefits largely from the production of nukes and from other military equipment that benefits Western imperialism. Another interesting development in regards to this is that Russia and China have, at least in words, defended the Venezuelan government. I think that this might be setting another stage for the inter-imperialist conflict between the USA, Canada, France, etc. versus China, Russia, and their allies. Anyways, this is episode 5 of En Masse. I just wanted to share a little bit about what's happening in Venezuela. And as I posted on Twitter a few weeks ago, I will be putting up a website soon for some audiobooks that I have created. And the first audiobook that I'll be putting out is for Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. And I'm really excited to put that out. And so I will inform y'all as to when that will be. Just keep posted to Twitter, Patreon, wherever else, and I will make sure to post about that. And also go to enmassepodcast.com if you want to see all the different links, you can find me on Facebook, find me on Instagram, Twitter, all those places where I promote this podcast and post about this podcast. I do have a few episodes coming up soon where I will have guests once more. One of the guests will be Ghazi Kozdo, who is a black activist in America, in the States, who will be talking about black liberation, its relationship to communism, its relationship to capitalism. Also, the APSP, or the African People's Socialist Party, which is an organization that they have left recently. And so, we're gonna talk a little bit about black liberation, things like that. It should be cool. I'm really looking forward to it. I know in the past I've mentioned that there was an Afghan comrade who was willing to talk about the situation in Afghanistan and the Maoist movement in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, that comrade is cautious about coming on here and saying anything because, and I made suggestions. I said, look, we can hide your identity, we can alter your voice, I'll do whatever it takes to get you on here. And unfortunately, they're still not interested, so that might not be happening as of yet, but I'll continue to push to get different guests to talk about what's happening in their countries and their revolutionary movements and their situation. But for the most part, I will be continuing to do this podcast. Thank you for those that have supported the podcast on Patreon. Even though I haven't put out anything since I told you that I made a Patreon, I will still continue to do this podcast. I am still doing this podcast. I have just been busy. I have been dealing with personal confidence and things like that, all types of struggles, and also just been busy in general. But overall, I am still here. I'm still doing this, and I am excited. But anyways, thank you for checking out En Masse Podcast, and hope to see you in the next episode, which will be hopefully within the next month or a month from now. So anyways, thank you and peace.